I never believed in God. Not as a child, not as a teenager, and certainly not at 26 when I found myself standing in front of the glass tomb containing the body of Carlo Acutis in Assisi, Italy. My disbelief wasn't the casual kind that most people claim when they say they're not really religious. Mine was deliberate, researched, fortified with years of reading Dawkins, Hitchens, and Harris. I debated Christians online, walked away from my Catholic upbringing at 15, and built my entire worldview on the foundation that this universe was governed by physics, chemistry, and blind chance. Nothing more. The irony that I ended up in Assisi at all still makes me shake my head. I'm a software engineer from Seattle, the kind of guy who spends his weekends debugging code and hiking in the Cascades, not visiting religious shrines in medieval Italian hill towns. But my girlfriend at the time, Emma, was an art history major writing her thesis on Franciscan architecture, and she'd begged me to come along on her research trip. I figured 3 weeks in Italy meant good food, decent wine, and plenty of time to work remotely from charming cafes. The religious stuff I could tune out. Emma knew about my atheism. We'd had plenty of good-natured arguments about it over the 2 years we'd been together. She wasn't particularly devout herself, more culturally Catholic than anything else, but she had that soft agnosticism that frustrates true non-believers. "I just think there's something," she'd say, which to me was intellectually lazy. Either you had evidence or you didn't. Either claims could be tested or they couldn't. Her something was just wishful thinking dressed up as openness. We'd already spent a week in Florence and another in Rome when she announced we were heading to Assisi. I groaned but agreed, expecting just another overdose of frescoes and medieval stone. What I didn't expect was that she'd insist on visiting the tomb of some dead teenager she'd read about online. "Carlo Acutis," she said, scrolling through her phone as we sat in a trattoria the night before. "He died in 2006, and they beatified him in 2020. He's buried at the Sanctuary of Spoliation, and apparently his body is, intact." I raised an eyebrow. "Intact how? Like, not decomposed?" "They exhumed him in 2019 and he looked the same." I laughed. "Right, and I'm sure that has nothing to do with modern embalming techniques." "I'm just saying it's interesting," Emma said, defensive. "He was only 15 when he died. Leukemia. But before that, he created this whole website cataloging Eucharistic miracles. He was really into computers and the internet. A teenage web developer who believed in transubstantiation," I said, unable to keep the mockery from my voice. "That's a contradiction if I've ever heard one. You can't be scientifically literate and believe that bread literally turns into flesh." Emma rolled her eyes. "You're so exhausting sometimes. Can you just come with me tomorrow without turning it into a debate?" I agreed, mostly because I didn't want to spend the day alone. Besides, I was curious in an anthropological way. The veneration of dead bodies, the machinery of saint-making, the whole enterprise of manufacturing holiness, it all fascinated me as a cultural phenomenon, even if I found the beliefs themselves absurd. The next morning, we took a bus up the winding roads to Assisi. The town itself was undeniably beautiful, all honey-colored stone perched on a hillside with views stretching across the Umbrian Valley. Emma was in her element, photographing everything, taking notes on the Romanesque and Gothic elements. I followed along, checking work emails on my phone and half listening to her commentary. The Sanctuary of the Spoliation, or Sanctuary of Spoliation as it's also called, wasn't the massive basilica I'd expected. It was a smaller church tucked into a quiet corner of Assisi, intimate and strangely modern compared to the medieval grandeur everywhere else. Emma explained as we approached that this was the place where St. Francis had stripped naked in front of his father, renouncing his wealth. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Stripped of illusions, I thought, though probably not in the way Francis intended. Inside, the church was sparse and peaceful. Afternoon light filtered through simple windows, and there was a hushed quality that had nothing to do with reverence and everything to do with good acoustics. A handful of people were scattered in the pews, praying or just sitting quietly, and there, in a side chapel behind glass, was the body of Carlo Acutis. I approached it with the same clinical curiosity I'd bring to any museum exhibit. The body was dressed in casual clothes, jeans, and a sweatshirt, laid out in a glass-fronted case that looked more like a display for a wax figure than a corpse. His face was visible, though clearly treated with some kind of silicone mask to preserve the features. I'd read about this technique, how they essentially create a death mask to present the body for veneration while the actual decomposition happens underneath. "He looks so young," Emma whispered beside me. "He was young," I said. 15. It's tragic, really. Leukemia is brutal. "Do you feel anything?" she asked, and I could hear the hope in her voice that maybe this would crack my skepticism. "I feel bad that a kid died," I said honestly. "But no, I don't feel any presence or whatever you're asking." She sighed but didn't push it. She wandered off to photograph architectural details, leaving me alone in front of the tomb. I stood there for a few more minutes, studying the setup with a critical eye. The whole presentation was well done, I had to admit. The casual clothes were a nice touch, making him seem relatable, accessible, not some distant medieval saint in robes. The millennial saint, or whatever they were calling him. Born in 1991, died in 2006. The same generation as me, essentially. There was a small informational plaque in English next to the tomb. I read through it with detached interest. Born in London, raised in Milan, passionate about the Eucharist and computers, created a website cataloging Eucharistic miracles around the world, died of acute promyelocytic leukemia on October 12, 2006. Beatified October 10, 2020. Canonized September 7, 2025. Wait, 2025? I blinked and read it again. The canonization date was just a few months away from when we were visiting. They'd already announced it. This kid, this teenager, was going to be officially declared a saint. I felt a familiar irritation rise up. The whole machinery of it, the way the Catholic Church manufactured saints with their bureaucratic processes and required miracles. It was medieval nonsense dressed up in modern paperwork. On impulse, I pulled out my phone. I don't know exactly why I did it. Maybe just to have a record, something to show my atheist friends back home. Look at this absurdity. A dead teenager in a glass case being worshipped. Or maybe I wanted to capture the moment for later reflection, to prove to myself that I'd stood in front of this supposed miracle and felt nothing. I opened my voice memo app, something I used regularly for work notes when I didn't want to type. I hit record and held the phone casually at my side, just letting it capture ambient sound. The church was quiet. I could hear the soft shuffle of footsteps somewhere behind me, the creak of a wooden pew. I stood there for maybe 2 minutes, not saying anything, just recording the silence, the space, the nothingness I felt. Then I stopped the recording, pocketed my phone, and went to find Emma. We spent the rest of the afternoon wandering Assisi, eating porchetta sandwiches, and visiting the massive Basilica of St. Francis, with its Giotto frescoes that Emma went crazy over. I barely thought about Carlo Acutis again. He was just another stop on the tourist trail, another curiosity, another example of how religion could take tragedy and spin it into mythology. That evening, we took the bus back to our rental apartment in Perugia. Emma was exhausted and happy, having gotten everything she needed for her thesis. I felt good too. Italy was beautiful, the food was incredible, and I was getting decent work done despite the travel. We had dinner, drank some wine, and fell asleep early. The next few days blurred together in a pleasant rhythm. We visited Orvieto, spent time in small hill towns, ate too much pasta. Work kept me busy during the mornings while Emma did her research. I completely forgot about the voice memo I'd recorded in Assisi. It was just one of dozens on my phone, mixed in with work notes and random thoughts I'd captured over the months. It wasn't until 5 days later, when we were back in Rome preparing to fly home, that I remembered it. I was sitting in our hotel room packing, while Emma was out getting last-minute souvenirs. I was going through my phone, clearing out space before the flight, deleting old photos and files I didn't need. That's when I saw it in my voice memos, a recording from Assisi, 2 minutes and 18 seconds long, dated 5 days earlier. I almost deleted it without listening, but something made me tap play. Maybe just curiosity about what I'd captured. Maybe boredom. Maybe something else. I held the phone to my ear and listened. At first, it was exactly what I expected. Silence. The faint ambient sound of the church. Maybe a slight rustling, probably from my pocket as I held the phone. Nothing unusual. Nothing interesting. Then, at around the 40-second mark, I heard it. A voice. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a voice. Clear and young, speaking in English with a slight Italian accent. Daniel, my name. I froze. The phone suddenly felt heavy in my hand. I pulled it away from my ear and stared at the screen, as if the device itself could explain what I'd just heard. Then I replayed it. Again, at 42 seconds. Daniel. My heart started to pound. This didn't make sense. I hadn't spoken during the recording. I knew I hadn't. I just stood there silently, holding the phone at my side. And no one else was close enough to me to be captured that clearly. The voice wasn't distant or muffled. It was right there, intimate, as if someone was standing next to me, speaking directly into the microphone. But there had been no one standing next to me. I kept listening, my hands beginning to shake. After my name, there was a pause, maybe 3 seconds, and then the voice continued. You think you're seeking truth, but you're afraid of where it leads. I dropped the phone. It clattered onto the tile floor of the hotel room, and I just sat there on the edge of the bed staring at it. My mind was racing, trying to process what I'd just heard, trying to find a rational explanation. A glitch, a recording that somehow got overlaid, someone else's audio bleeding into mine, anything. I picked up the phone with trembling hands and played it again. Daniel, you think you're seeking truth, but you're afraid of where it leads. The voice was calm, gentle almost, not accusatory. But hearing my name, hearing this impossible message, it felt like someone had reached through time and space to speak directly to me. And the words themselves, they cut right through every defense I'd built. I played it again, and again, and again. Each time, I tried to find something I'd missed. Background noise that could explain it, some technical artifact. But the voice was too clear, too present. It wasn't a radio bleeding through or a distant conversation picked up by mistake. It was there, in the recording, speaking my name, saying words that seemed aimed precisely at my soul. I pulled my laptop out of my suitcase and transferred the audio file. I opened it in Audacity and stared at the waveform. There it was, a clear spike at the 42-second mark. The voice wasn't buried in static. It stood out distinctly. I zoomed in, studying every peak and valley. The voice had a different frequency signature than the background. It was centered, prominent, exactly where a voice speaking directly into the microphone would appear. I isolated those 12 seconds and played them on loop. Daniel, the way my name was said, with a slight upward inflection. Danielle, not flattened and quick like Americans said it, but with a gentle European musicality. You think you're seeking truth. The emphasis was on think, but you're afraid of where it leads. The word afraid had weight, each syllable clear. I checked the metadata. Recording date, 5 days ago. Location, Assisi, Italy. Recording device, iPhone 12 Pro. Everything was normal. No signs of tampering, but that voice shouldn't be there. I thought about the physics of sound. For my phone to record a voice that clearly the source would need to be close, within a couple of feet. But this voice was crisp, intimate, like someone speaking directly at my phone, except no one had been there. I remembered the moment with absolute clarity. I'd stood alone. Emma was photographing elsewhere. Other visitors were distant, their conversations just murmurs. No one had approached me. Maybe Emma had set this up somehow, but she wasn't technically sophisticated enough, and the metadata showed no editing. I spent hours running every test, checked for compression artifacts, analyzed reverb patterns, researched electromagnetic interference. Nothing fit. Around midnight, I searched online for voice on recording that shouldn't be there and found EVP researchers, electronic voice phenomena. Most recordings were wishful thinking, static that people interpreted as words, but mine wasn't like that. No ambiguity. I could transcribe it perfectly. Daniel, you think you're seeking truth, but you're afraid of where it leads. I almost posted it on a skeptics forum but stopped. Whatever explanations they offered would feel as hollow as mine. Instead, I kept listening. Past 2 a.m., sitting in the dark with headphones on, playing those 12 seconds endlessly. Each repetition drove the words deeper. The voice haunted me not just because it was impossible, but because of what it said. Was I afraid of truth? I'd built my identity around facing reality unflinchingly. I'd walked away from my Catholic family at 15, argued with believers for years, always from the position that I was brave enough to accept a godless universe while they needed fairy tales. But in that dark hotel room, listening to my name spoken by a voice that shouldn't exist, the foundation cracked. Because if I was really seeking truth, I'd have to engage with this seriously. And that's where the fear came in. Fear of being wrong. Fear of what it would cost. Fear of intellectual humiliation. Fear of what my atheist friends would think. Fear of rebuilding my entire worldview. Fear of what it meant if there was something beyond death. Fear of God, if God existed. I listened to the rest of the recording. After the voice, there was more silence, just the ambient sound of the church, and then the recording ended. Nothing else unusual, just those 12 seconds that contained the impossible. When Emma came back an hour later, loaded down with shopping bags, she found me sitting in the same spot, phone in hand, face pale. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately, dropping her bags. I couldn't speak at first. I just held out the phone and pressed play. She listened, her face initially confused, then shocked. Did someone say your name?" "Keep listening," I whispered. When it finished, she looked at me with wide eyes. "Daniel, what is this? When did you record this?" "In Assisi," I said, my voice hollow. "At the tomb. I recorded it while I was standing there. I didn't say anything. No one was near me. I don't understand how this is on here." Emma played it again, then again. "This is insane," she said. "Could it be a glitch? Could your phone have picked up something from somewhere else?" "I don't know," I said, but I'd already been through every technical explanation I could think of. None of them fit. The voice was too clear, too direct, and it knew my name. It spoke about truth and fear, concepts I'd never discussed in that church, never even thought about clearly while standing there. "Maybe it's a prank?" Emma suggested. "Could someone have hacked your phone and recorded a message to play specifically when I was standing in front of Carlo Acutis' tomb?" I said. "That's more far-fetched than any other explanation." We spent the next hour going through every possibility, but nothing made sense. Finally, Emma said what I knew she was thinking but didn't want to say. "What if it's real? What if it's actually him, Carlo?" "That's not possible," I said automatically. "Dead people don't speak, certainly not through cell phone recordings made 15 years after they died." "But you heard it," Emma pressed. "We both heard it. Your name. That message. How else do you explain it?" I couldn't. And that was the problem. For the first time in my adult life, I was faced with something I couldn't explain away, couldn't rationalize, couldn't fit into my carefully constructed materialist worldview, and it terrified me. We flew home the next day. During the entire 11-hour flight, I must have listened to that recording 50 times. I put in my earbuds, closed my eyes, and played it over and over, as if repetition would somehow make it make sense. Each time I heard my name, my stomach dropped. Each time I heard those words about truth and fear, something twisted inside me. Because here's the thing. The message was right. I did think I was seeking truth. My entire atheism was built on that foundation, that I was brave enough to face reality without comforting illusions. But was I afraid of where truth led? The question burrowed into my mind like a parasite. Back in Seattle, I couldn't let it go. I tried to return to normal life, to work, to routine, but the recording haunted me. I showed it to my best friend Marcus, another atheist and an audio engineer. He analyzed it on his equipment, running it through software that checked for signs of manipulation or overlay. "It's clean," he said, looking troubled. "I can't find any evidence of editing or layering. The voice appears to be recorded at the same time and place as the ambient sound. It's all one seamless recording." "There has to be an explanation," I insisted. "I'm sure there is," Marcus said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Maybe some kind of acoustic phenomenon we don't understand. Maybe the church architecture caused some weird echo delay effect. Maybe someone was speaking in another room and the sound carried in an unusual way." We both knew he was grasping at straws. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and the voice kept playing in my head. "Daniel, you think you're seeking truth, but you're afraid of where it leads." Was I afraid? I'd always prided myself on intellectual courage, on being willing to follow evidence wherever it led. But maybe that was only when I knew where the evidence was leading. Maybe I was brave when truth confirmed what I already believed, but faced with something that challenged everything, I was paralyzed. The next night was the same. I'd doze off for an hour, then wake up with my heart racing, the voice echoing in my thoughts. I tried listening to the recording again, thinking maybe familiarity would dull its impact, but it only made things worse. Each time I noticed something new, the gentleness of the tone, the slight pause before my name, as if the speaker was waiting for me to notice, the careful choice of words, not condemning, just observing. By the third night of barely sleeping, I was a wreck. Emma was worried. My work started to suffer. I'd sit at my computer trying to code, but my mind would wander back to Assisi, to that moment in front of the tomb, to the impossible recording. The The fourth night, I tried everything to sleep. Melatonin, chamomile tea, white noise, phone in another room. Nothing worked. When I closed my eyes, I'd see the waveform, those distinctive spikes. I'd hear my name. Around 3 a.m., I gave up. I sat on the couch in the dark and played the recording again. Hundreds of times by then. But I kept searching for something, some clue, some explanation. I started timing it obsessively. The pause between Daniel and you think was 2.8 seconds. The entire message, 12.3 seconds. I knew these numbers by heart. The fifth night, I tried sleeping pills. They made me drowsy, but didn't stop the thoughts. In that liminal space, I kept hearing variations. Daniel, why are you running? Daniel, what are you afraid of? I'd jolt awake, unsure if I'd been dreaming. Emma found me at 6 a.m., sitting at my kitchen table with my phone, headphones on, eyes red from lack of sleep. The recording was playing on loop. She didn't say anything at first, just sat down across from me with a look of profound concern. You can't keep doing this, she finally said. I know, I replied, but I didn't stop the recording. Have you slept at all? Maybe an hour. Daniel, this isn't healthy. I need to understand it, I interrupted. There has to be an explanation. Sound doesn't just appear on recordings. Voices don't materialize out of nowhere. There's a rational explanation, and I just need to find it. But even as I said it, I knew I was lying to myself. I'd exhausted every rational explanation. What I was really doing was avoiding the irrational one, the one that terrified me more than sleeplessness ever could. By the end of the first week, I'd developed a routine. Work on autopilot, fueled by coffee. Come home, eat mindlessly, run the audio through analysis programs. I joined forums under fake names, asking technical questions about recording anomalies, never mentioning the content. No one had an explanation that fit. Nights were worst. Exhausted, aching for sleep. But my mind wouldn't shut off. I'd think about the voice, about Carlo, about whether the universe was really just particles or if there might be something more. The thoughts spiraled endlessly. The second week, panic attacks started. They'd come late at night. Heart racing, chest tight, suffocating. Pure terror, existential dread given physical form. I made mistakes at work. Simple errors I'd normally catch. My manager noticed. Is everything okay? Just some personal stuff, I lied. Marcus, my audio engineer friend, kept texting me. Any progress on that recording? I'd send back non-committal responses. The truth was, I'd stopped looking for technical explanations. I'd exhausted them all. Now I was researching different things. Catholic theology, beatification processes, miracles, the afterlife. Things I would have laughed at weeks earlier. I felt like I was betraying myself reading this material. Every click on a Catholic website felt like surrender. But I couldn't help it. I needed to understand. I read everything I could find about Carlo Acutis, staying up until 4 or 5 a.m., scrolling through websites, watching YouTube videos, reading testimonies. Part of me was still skeptical, still looking for cracks in the narrative, evidence of exaggeration or fraud. But another part, a growing part, was simply trying to understand who this person was, whose tomb I'd stood in front of, who might have reached across death to speak to me, who had shattered my comfortable certainties with 12 impossible seconds. The more I learned, the more uncomfortable I became. Carlo wasn't some ancient mystic or medieval saint whose life existed in the realm of myth. He was real, tangible, contemporary. Born in 1991, the same decade as me. Grew up with the internet, played video games, watched Pokemon. He could have been my classmate, my friend, someone I might have known. And yet he believed things I found absurd. Transubstantiation, the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, the power of the Rosary. He'd spent his teenage years creating websites about Eucharistic miracles, traveling around the world to catalog instances where consecrated hosts had supposedly bled or turned to actual flesh. As a web developer myself, I appreciated the technical skill involved. The websites were well designed, accessible, clearly the work of someone who understood user experience and information architecture. But the content made my rational mind rebel. Bread turning into flesh? Blood on communion wafers? These were the kinds of claims that required extraordinary evidence, the kinds of things that scientific investigation should easily debunk. And yet, Carlo had believed absolutely, had documented hundreds of these supposed miracles with photos and testimonies, and sometimes even scientific analysis reports. I found myself on websites I'd never thought I'd visit, Catholic apologetics sites, blogs about saints, forums where people discussed their prayer lives and spiritual experiences. It all seemed foreign to me, like stumbling into a parallel universe where the rules of reality were different. But the recording on my phone suggested that maybe I was the one who didn't understand the rules. By the third week, I'd lost 10 pounds. I wasn't eating properly, wasn't sleeping more than 2 or 3 hours a night, existed in a fog of exhaustion and obsessive thinking. Emma tried to help, bringing me food, urging me to see a doctor, but I pushed her away. This was something I had to figure out alone, except I couldn't figure it out. That was the problem. There was no solution, no answer, no way to make this make sense within my existing framework. The recording existed. The voice was there. My name was spoken. The message was delivered. These were facts, as solid as any empirical data, but they pointed to conclusions I couldn't accept. I started having conversations with the recording. Late at night, delirious from lack of sleep, I'd play it and then respond out loud. "Why me?" I'd ask. "Why did you speak to me? What do you want from me?" Of course, there was no answer. Just the same 12 seconds playing on loop. "Daniel, you think you're seeking truth, but you're afraid of where it leads." "I'm not afraid," I'd insist, lying. "I just need evidence. Real evidence. Not just voices on recordings that could be anything." But the voice remained unchanging, patient, gentle, waiting for me to stop arguing and start listening. One night, around 2 a.m. in my 4th week back from Italy, I found myself on a Catholic website reading about the theological concept of grace. It described grace as God's initiative, God reaching out to people who couldn't or wouldn't reach back on their own. It talked about how grace often comes through unexpected means, through ordinary things made extraordinary, through technology, through voices, through moments that crack open our certainties and force us to see beyond ourselves. I thought about my phone, an ordinary piece of technology, and I thought about a voice memo, an ordinary recording, and I thought about how the intersection of those two ordinary things had produced something I couldn't explain, something that had shattered my certainty and robbed me of sleep and left me here at 2 a.m. reading Catholic theology on my laptop. If that wasn't grace, I didn't know what was, though I still wasn't sure I believed in grace at all. The panic attacks got worse. Some nights, I'd wake up gasping, convinced I was dying, my heart hammering. I'd stumble to the bathroom, splash water on my face, and stare at my reflection. I looked terrible. Dark circles, pale skin, hair disheveled. I looked like someone having a breakdown. A man who'd lost more than sleep. Someone who'd lost his certainty, his foundation, his carefully constructed sense of control. Maybe I was. "You're losing it," I told my reflection. Over a recording, over 12 seconds of audio that probably has some perfectly normal explanation you just haven't thought of yet. You're a software engineer. You solve problems. Figure this out. But my reflection didn't look convinced. Neither was I. The truth was staring me in the face, and I was the one refusing to see it. I started researching Carlo Acutis obsessively. I read everything I could find about him, watching videos, reading testimonies from people who knew him, studying the miracles attributed to him. The first miracle involved a Brazilian boy named Matthias, who was healed of a serious pancreatic condition after praying to Carlo. The second was a university student in Florence named Liliana, who recovered from severe head trauma after a bicycle accident. I told myself I was looking for explanations, for evidence of fraud or exaggeration, but really, I was trying to understand who this person was whose tomb I'd stood in front of. This teenager who died of leukemia, but who somehow seemed to have reached across time to speak to me. The more I learned about Carlo, the more uncomfortable I became. He wasn't some medieval mystic or cloistered monk. He was a normal kid, really. He loved his dog, played video games, watched Pokemon. He was good with computers, built websites, understood technology in a way that should have made him skeptical of religious claims. But instead, he'd combined his tech skills with deep Catholic faith, creating elaborate websites documenting Eucharistic miracles around the world. I found videos of people who'd known him. His mother, Antonia, spoke about how, even as a small child, Carlo had been drawn to the Eucharist, how he'd insisted on going to Mass daily, even when his parents didn't want to go, how he'd say things like, The Eucharist is my highway to heaven. Teachers described him as brilliant but humble, always helping classmates who struggled, never showing off his intelligence. There was footage of the website he'd created about Eucharistic miracles. I spent hours clicking through it, examining his work with my developer's eye. The site was impressive, especially for a teenager in the early 2000s. Good navigation, clear presentation of information, responsive design before responsive design was standard. He'd cataloged miracles from around the world. Lanciano, Italy, where consecrated bread had reportedly turned to heart tissue in the 8th century. Buenos Aires, where a communion wafer had allegedly bled and been scientifically tested. Sokoka, Poland. Legnica, Poland. Dozens of cases, each documented with photos, historical context, and often scientific analysis. As a skeptic, I should have been scoffing. Medieval superstition preserved in amber, I should have thought. People seeing what they wanted to see in bread that got moldy or discolored. But the scientific reports were harder to dismiss. Heart tissue where there should be bread. Human blood type AB. White blood cells present in centuries-old samples that shouldn't be. Either these reports were all fraudulent or something genuinely inexplicable was happening. I found myself watching a video of Carlo's funeral from October 2006. Hundreds of people packed into Santa Maria Sagrada Church in Milan. His small white casket, his mother weeping. He'd been just 15, dead from a brutal form of leukemia that had killed him in less than 2 weeks from diagnosis to death. Acute promyelocytic leukemia, the report said. He'd gone from healthy teenager to corpse in 12 days. What struck me was what he'd said during those final days. His mother recounted how Carlo had offered his suffering for the Pope and for the Church, how even in agony, he'd been peaceful, accepting. "I'm happy to die," he'd reportedly said, "because I've lived my life without wasting even a minute on things that don't please God." I was 26. What had I spent my life on? Coding, yes. Building things, solving problems. But also arguing with strangers online, proving my intellectual superiority, mocking people who believed different things than I did. Had I wasted my time on things that didn't matter? The question gnawed at me during sleepless nights. I learned that Carlo had been beatified on October 10th, 2020, in Assisi. The ceremony had been held outdoors, in the square in front of the Basilica of St. Francis, because of COVID restrictions. His mother and father had been there, along with thousands of others. Pope Francis himself had been involved in the process, though the actual beatification ceremony was performed by Cardinal Agostino Vallini. Then, just months before Emma and I had visited, Carlo had been canonized. September 7th, 2025. Pope Leo XIV had presided over the ceremony in St. Peter's Square in Rome. Carlo Acutis, the first millennial saint, the influencer of God, or saint of the internet as headlines called him, a 15-year-old who loved computers and video games, was now officially recognized by the Catholic Church as being in heaven, able to intercede for the living. It all seemed fantastical to me, this machinery of saint-making. But then I'd remember the recording, and fantastical didn't seem impossible anymore. I found blog posts from people who claimed Carlo had interceded for them. A woman whose son was cured of brain cancer after praying to Carlo. A man whose failing business turned around after visiting Carlo's tomb. A teenager who'd overcome suicidal depression through Carlo's example. Hundreds of testimonies, thousands maybe. Some sounded exaggerated, the kind of thing people convince themselves of because they want to believe. But others had a ring of authenticity that troubled me. One testimony particularly stayed with me. A former atheist, a philosophy professor from Germany, who'd visited Carlo's tomb out of academic curiosity while researching Catholic saint cults. He'd stood there analyzing the whole phenomenon with scholarly detachment. And then, he wrote, he'd felt something he couldn't explain. Not a voice or a vision, just a sudden, overwhelming sense of being known and loved. He'd left the church shaken, spent the next 6 months reading theology and wrestling with the experience, and eventually converted to Catholicism. Reading his story, I felt a sick recognition. I saw myself in his scholarly detachment, his certainty that he was above this kind of religious experience. I saw my own trajectory potentially laid out before me, and it terrified me. I didn't want to convert. I didn't want to become religious. I didn't want to be the guy who'd spent a decade defending atheism only to fold because of one weird experience in Italy. My friends would never let me hear the end of it. My family would be insufferable, insisting they'd always known I'd come back to the faith. But what if truth didn't care about my preferences? What if reality was what it was, regardless of how I felt about it? I found myself reading the actual testimonies from Carlo's beatification process, the official documentation. The first miracle, the healing of the Brazilian boy Matthias. He'd had a severe pancreatic malformation, a congenital condition that should have required major surgery with uncertain outcomes. His mother had prayed to Carlo, visited his tomb in Assisi, and brought back a relic, a piece of cloth that had touched Carlo's body. She'd pressed this relic to Matthias's body while praying, and the child's condition had healed. Doctors confirmed it. No surgery needed. The malformation was simply gone. The medical documentation was extensive. Multiple doctors had examined the boy before and after. The pancreatic defect was well documented in scans and tests. And then it wasn't there anymore. The medical experts called in by the Beatification Commission couldn't explain it. They'd ruled out misdiagnosis, spontaneous remission, or any natural medical explanation. The healing was, in their professional opinion, scientifically inexplicable. I spent an entire night reading through the medical reports, looking for loopholes, for any sign that the doctors were biased or incompetent or fraudulent. I found none. These were legitimate medical professionals doing legitimate evaluations. Either they were all lying as part of some vast conspiracy to create a fake saint, or something genuinely miraculous had happened to that boy. The second miracle, the one that led to Carlo's canonization just months before my visit, was similarly well documented. Liliana, the university student in Florence, had suffered severe head trauma in a bicycle accident. She'd been in a coma, brain swelling so severe that doctors said she'd likely die or suffer permanent brain damage if she survived. Her mother had prayed to Carlo, now a beato, asking for his intercession, and Liliana had woken up, healed, with no brain damage. Another inexplicable recovery. Another miracle that passed the Vatican's rigorous investigation process. I tried to remain skeptical. The Vatican's miracle investigation process was thorough, yes, but it was also conducted by people who wanted to find miracles. Confirmation bias could explain a lot, and even genuine, inexplicable healings didn't necessarily point to Catholic truth. Maybe there were natural healing processes we didn't understand yet. Maybe the power of belief itself could trigger physiological changes. Maybe. But with each maybe, I felt more like I was the one engaged in wishful thinking, clinging to naturalistic explanations because the alternative was too frightening to accept. I learned about Carlo's final days in detail, reading his mother's testimony and accounts from the nurses who'd cared for him. The symptoms had started October 1st, 2006, with what seemed like a simple sore throat. By October 8th, he was critically ill, diagnosed with one of the most aggressive forms of leukemia. He was transferred to San Gerardo Hospital in Monza, given chemotherapy, but his body couldn't fight it. On October 10th, he'd asked for the anointing of the sick, the Catholic last rites. On October 11th, he'd slipped into a coma from a cerebral hemorrhage. On October 12th, at 6:45 in the morning, he'd died, 15 years old. The same age as some of my students when I did guest lectures at the university. Kids worried about video games and homework and whether their crush liked them back. And Carlo had faced death with a maturity and faith that humbled me. I'm happy to die because I've lived my life without wasting even a minute on things that don't please God. Could I say the same? Had I lived my life with any higher purpose than my own satisfaction and intellectual pride? I read about his devotion to the Eucharist, how he'd attended daily Mass, how he'd called the Eucharist his highway to heaven. The phrase stuck with me. In my worldview, the Eucharist was just bread and wine, ritual cannibalism dressed up in metaphor. But Carlo had believed it was literally Christ, body and blood, divinity concealed under ordinary appearances. He'd organized his whole life around this belief, this conviction that in every Catholic church in the world, in every tabernacle, God was physically present waiting to be encountered. What would it be like to believe that? To walk into a church and know, absolutely know, that you were in the presence of the creator of the universe? I couldn't even imagine it. My church experiences had all been dead ritual, boring repetition, meaningless gestures, but for Carlo, it had been everything. There was something about that combination that disturbed me. I'd always assumed that scientific literacy and religious faith were incompatible, that truly intelligent people who understood technology and evidence would naturally drift toward atheism. But here was someone who understood computers, who lived in the modern world, who was by all accounts brilliant, and who believed absolutely in the literal presence of Christ in the Eucharist. It challenged my neat categories. A week after returning from Italy, I still wasn't sleeping properly. I'd lie awake for hours, then drift into restless sleep filled with strange dreams. In one, I was back in the church in Assisi, but now Carlo's body was sitting up in the glass case, looking at me with gentle eyes. In another, I was trying to delete the recording from my phone, but no matter how many times I pressed delete, it remained, playing on loop. I became obsessed with the specific words. You think you're seeking truth, but you're afraid of where it leads. What was I afraid of? I started making lists in the middle of the night, trying to articulate my fears. Afraid of being wrong. Afraid of looking foolish to my atheist friends. Afraid of having wasted years on a false premise. Afraid of what it would mean if there really was something beyond material reality. Afraid of God, if God existed. Afraid of judgment. Afraid of having to change everything. The lists got longer and more desperate as the nights wore on. Emma eventually moved back to her own apartment. I can't watch you do this to yourself, she said. You need help, Daniel. Real help. Maybe see a therapist. But how could I explain this to a therapist? I tried once, making an appointment with a counselor. I sat in her office and told her about the recording, and I could see in her face that she thought I was having some kind of break with reality. She gently suggested that stress and travel could cause auditory hallucinations, that perhaps I'd imagined the voice or my memory was playing tricks. But other people have heard it, I protested. My girlfriend heard it. My friend analyzed it. Sometimes we can convince ourselves we hear things that aren't there, she said carefully, especially when we're in suggestible environments like churches. I never went back. 2 weeks after Italy, I was sleeping maybe 2 hours a night. I'd go to work exhausted, function on autopilot, then come home and lie awake, listening to the recording again and again. I must have played it 1,000 times. I had it memorized down to the exact rhythm of the words, the slight breath before Daniel, the pause that followed truth. My friends started avoiding me. Marcus stopped responding to my texts about the recording. My work performance declined so much that my manager pulled me aside for a concerned conversation. I was spiraling, and I knew it, but I couldn't stop. Because here's what I couldn't escape. Something impossible had happened. Either I had to accept that the material world I'd believed in so absolutely could produce inexplicable phenomena that looked indistinguishable from the supernatural, or I had to consider that maybe, just maybe, there was something beyond matter and energy. Something that could speak across the boundary of death. Something that knew my name and saw into my heart. Both options terrified me. The rational part of my mind kept insisting there had to be an explanation. Some acoustic quirk. Some technological glitch I didn't understand. Maybe radio interference. Maybe a pocket dial that somehow captured someone else's conversation. Maybe a million things I hadn't thought of yet. But none of these explanations held up under scrutiny. The voice was too clear. The message too specific. My name too precise. And then there were the words themselves. You think you're seeking truth, but you're afraid of where it leads. The more I sat with them, the more they unraveled me. Because they were true. I had been afraid. I was afraid. All my confident atheism, all my certainty, it was built on the assumption that I already knew what truth looked like. Materialist, empirical, testable, bounded by the laws of physics. But what if truth was larger than that? What if following evidence wherever it led meant accepting things that violated my neat worldview? 3 weeks after Italy, at 3 a.m, unable to sleep again, I did something I never thought I'd do. I got out of bed, knelt down on the floor of my bedroom and tried to pray. I felt ridiculous. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know if anyone was listening. But I was so tired, so desperate, so completely at the end of myself that I had to try something. Carlo, I said out loud, feeling foolish. If that was really you on the recording, if you can hear me somehow, I need help. I need to understand what's happening. I need to sleep. I didn't know what I needed. I just knelt there in the dark, a 26-year-old software engineer who'd spent a decade building arguments against God's existence, now reduced to begging a dead teenager for answers. Nothing happened. No voice, no vision, no sense of presence. Just me, alone in my room, feeling like an idiot. I climbed back into bed and lay there. And maybe from sheer exhaustion, I finally fell into deep sleep. I slept for 10 hours straight, the longest I'd slept since Italy. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming through my window, and for the first time in weeks, my mind felt quiet. The recording was still on my phone. The voice was still there. Nothing about the objective situation had changed, but something in me had shifted. Maybe it was just finally admitting that I didn't have all the answers. Maybe it was surrendering the need to explain everything. Maybe it was acknowledging that truth might be bigger and stranger than I'd allowed for. I still don't know what to make of what happened. I'm not a Catholic. I haven't had some dramatic conversion experience. I haven't joined a church or started going to Mass. But I can't call myself an atheist anymore either. That certainty is gone, dissolved by 12 seconds of audio that shouldn't exist. What I am now is someone who sleeps a little better at night, but who lies awake sometimes thinking about a 15-year-old boy who loved computers and believed in God, who died too young but whose presence seems to linger in ways I can't explain. I'm someone who carries a recording on his phone that he'll never delete, even though listening to it still makes his hands shake. Daniel, you think you're seeking truth, but you're afraid of where it leads. I'm still afraid. But I'm also starting to wonder if following that fear might be the most honest thing I've ever done. Because real truth, if it exists, won't bend to fit my comfort level. It won't accommodate my preferences. It won't spare my pride. And maybe that's what Carlo was trying to tell me. Maybe that's what kept me awake all those nights. Not the impossibility of the recording itself, but what it revealed about me. That my atheism wasn't built on fearless pursuit of truth, but on the fear of what truth might actually be. I went back to work. I reconnected with Emma, though we decided we were better as friends. I started living again, functioning, moving forward. But something had changed fundamentally. I noticed things I'd dismissed before. Moments of beauty that seemed too perfect to be random. Connections between people that felt designed rather than accidental. The complexity of consciousness itself, the sheer miracle of being aware, of existing, of experiencing this strange universe. I started reading different books. Not just the atheist screeds I'd surrounded myself with, but philosophy, theology, accounts from people who'd had experiences they couldn't explain. I wasn't convinced by all of it, not even most of it, but I was listening with different ears, approaching with different assumptions. About a month after returning from Italy, I got an email from my credit card company about a charge in Rome. It was for a small donation I'd apparently made to the Sanctuary of Spoliation on the day we visited Carlo's tomb. I had no memory of making any donation. I'd just wandered through, recorded my voice memo, and left. But there it was in my transaction history. €5. Made at exactly 2:47 p.m. on the day I'd recorded the audio. I sat there staring at my computer screen, trying to remember. Had Emma made a donation and used my card? Had I dropped some coins in a box without thinking? It was such a small thing, so easily explained, but it felt like another thread in a tapestry I was only beginning to see. That night, I listened to the recording again. But this time, instead of fear or desperation or the need to explain, I just listened, really listened, to the voice, to the words, to whatever message was being offered. Daniel, you think you're seeking truth, but you're afraid of where it leads. I am afraid, I said out loud to my empty apartment. But maybe that's okay. Maybe fear is part of it. I thought about Carlo, 15 years old, dying of leukemia, surrounded by the certainty that death wasn't the end. I thought about how much courage that must have taken, to face the dissolution of your body with faith that something continued beyond it. I thought about how he'd used his final months to create something that would outlast him, a website about miracles, a testimony to what he believed. And I thought about how I'd spent my 20s building arguments against the possibility of what he died believing in. How confident I'd been, how certain, how blind. The recording had taken my sleep not because it proved anything, but because it questioned everything. And maybe that's what I needed. Not answers, but questions. Not certainty, but doubt. Not the confidence of knowing, but the humility of mystery. I still can't explain how my name got on that recording. I still can't explain the message or how it seemed to know exactly what I needed to hear. Maybe there's a technical explanation I haven't found. Maybe there's a rational answer I'm missing. Or maybe, just maybe, a 15-year-old boy who loved God and computers found a way to reach across death and time to shake one stubborn atheist awake. Either way, I'm awake now. Not sleeping peacefully, but sleeping. Living with questions instead of answers. Okay with not knowing. Open to wherever truth actually leads, even if it terrifies me. The recording sits on my phone like a small bomb that's already detonated. I don't listen to it much anymore. I don't need to. The words are carved into my memory, into my consciousness, into the architecture of how I see the world now. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I think about going back to Assisi. I think about standing in front of that glass tomb again, older and maybe slightly wiser, and saying thank you to Carlo, to God, to whatever force in the universe cares enough about one stubborn skeptic to rob him of his sleep until he finally paid attention. But I haven't gone back yet. Maybe I'm still afraid. Maybe I'm waiting until I have something more to say than just, I heard you. Maybe I'm waiting until I know what comes next. Because that's the thing about having your certainty shattered. You don't immediately rebuild it. You live in the rubble for a while, sorting through what was real and what was just comforting lies you told yourself. You sit with the discomfort. You learn to sleep with monsters under the bed, except the monsters turn out to be possibilities you'd refuse to consider. I'm still that software engineer from Seattle. I still write code, still hike in the Cascades, still enjoy the life I built. But I'm not the same person who recorded that audio in Assisi. That person died somewhere in the sleepless nights, in the obsessive listening, in the final admission that maybe he didn't know as much as he thought. What emerged from that death is someone I'm still getting to know. Someone who can hold paradox. Someone who can say, I don't know, without immediately rushing to fill the void with certainty. Someone who can carry both doubt and possibility, skepticism and openness, fear and curiosity. The audio recording took my sleep, yes, but it gave me something back. Not faith, exactly. Not belief in the traditional sense, but a kind of wakefulness that's more valuable than any sleep I lost. An attention to what's actually here, in this strange universe, in this brief life, in these moments that might be shot through with more meaning than I'd ever allowed for. Carlo Acutis was 15 when he died. He spent his short life paying attention to the sacred, documenting moments where the ordinary opened up to reveal the extraordinary. Eucharistic miracles, he called them. Moments when bread became more than bread, when the material world became transparent to something beyond itself. Maybe that's what happened with my recording. Maybe it was a kind of miracle, a moment when ordinary technology became transparent to something beyond. Or maybe it was just an inexplicable glitch, a cosmic accident that happened to contain exactly the message I needed. I don't know which, but I'm finally okay with not knowing. And at night, when I lie down to sleep, I don't hear that voice anymore echoing through my thoughts. Instead, I hear something like silence, but a richer silence, one that might contain voices I'm only beginning to learn how to hear. The tomb in Assisi holds the body of a boy who believed the universe was more than matter. The phone in my pocket holds a recording that might prove him right. And somewhere between those two impossibilities, I'm learning to live awake. If this story has stirred something in your heart, I invite you to explore the mystery of Carlo Acutis further. Subscribe to this channel, leave your like, and activate the notification bell for more testimonies that challenge us to see beyond what we think we know.